Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, good morning, everybody, with a warm welcome to the International Peace Institute and to the Trygve Center here in New York City. This is the fifth Trygve Symposium, and the topic this year is States in Transition, Ensuring Equal Rights and Participation for All. First of all, I would like to thank the Foreign Minister of Norway, Espen Barth Eide, for chairing the discussion today. Espen is the new Foreign Minister of Norway. He was actually named to the post only last week, being last week the Minister for Defense. Espen is an old friend, and indeed an old friend of IPI, and I think you've been several times, both in your capacity as State Secretary of Norway in the Foreign Ministry and Minister for Defense here. So it's a great pleasure to have you as a speaker here this year as well. I'm also very pleased to welcome such a distinguished set of panelists. I couldn't think, actually, of a more suitable group of speakers to address the issue at hand. The panelists constitute a real cross-section of civil society activists, analysts, and the highest level of government representatives. The subject we are addressing this morning is at the very heart of the success or failure of transformations taking place in the Middle East, and it deserves special attention by the UN community here in New York. Though economic grievances have been at the origins of the uprisings, political demands are equally important. People across the region not only want bread, but they also want their vote to count, to be treated equally by the law. They are fighting for their dignity, they are fighting for their humanity, and they are fighting for their identity. As it was often stated in the demonstrations, they want to be citizens and not subjects. The challenges are enormous. However, the transition processes are in danger of being derailed at any moment. There are, in fact, serious risks of regression of basic freedoms, and particularly for women. I am very much looking forward to hearing the views of our panelists on these opportunities and challenges. Before we start, may I remind you to please turn off your cell phones. And let me now introduce the members of the panel. Rafik Ben Abdesalem is the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Tunisia. Mario Otero is United States Undersecretary of State for Democracy and Global Affairs. Louis Arbour, also a very old friend of the International Peace Institute and a colleague, is the President of the International Crisis Group. Isra Abdel Fattah is the co-founder of the April 6 movement in Egypt. And Ala Mourabit is the founder of the Voice of Libyan Women. And then we have Vidar Helgesen. Finally, there is a name I'm sure I pronounced correctly here. Is the Secretary General of the International IDEA, the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, which is an international organization, as we say, an IO, which plays a leading role in supporting democracy worldwide. It is now my great pleasure to hand the reins of this year's Trygve Symposium over to the Foreign Minister of Norway. Espen, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Terje. It's a great pleasure to be here again at the Trygve Symposium, which has become a good tradition. And I will start by disagreeing with Terje on one issue. I don't think you should turn off your mobile phones. You should put them on silent, because we are also participating on Twitter, and there is a hashtag for this meeting, as we do these days. I realize that everyone in the panel has a Twitter account, so we will be able to follow that. And the hashtag is Trygve in one word. So put it on silent, which is a good idea, but keep it on and take part in the electronic discussion as well as the physical discussion as we do these days. Then to the topic, we are living in times of significant change and transition. And we have been inspired by developments in many parts of the world, not the least in the Arab world, which has opened up some new opportunities to millions of people, and where we saw the active participation of groups that have traditionally been outside of politics. That is deeply inspiring, and I think that many of us who are living outside of the Arab world used to think erroneously that the situation was not very good, but if it changed, it would become worse. And what we learned is that the situation was definitely not good, and there was also an opportunity for getting it right, getting it better. And a lot of people turn up in the partly peaceful, partly not so peaceful revolutions or change movements with an approach to society and politics which we could recognize: participation, election, freedom. But beyond, just having a vote, but actually transforming societies. So there's a lot of inspiration to be found in that. At the same time, we have also seen horrendous examples of the opposite, of violent conflicts between sectarian groups, as the one we're seeing now in Syria, which is heartbreaking. And where you see not only regimes completely unable to adapt to demands of citizens, but also opposition groups that are portraying ambitions very different from those that led to the peaceful demonstrations. There are all kinds of things happening in this. And I think that in a climate of significant change and significant transformation, we have to learn from the good examples, both the recent good examples, but also the examples that are somewhat behind us in transitional societies. How do we actually manage the inclusion of people who are normally not a part of the politics? A good example of that is the participation of women. And let me state right from the outset that in Norway's position, there is a need to promote the position of women, but not only that. There's a need to understand societal change also as a gender perspective. We cannot just believe that we can add women to a male-dominated society and it will stay the same. With quota systems and other, there's a lot of lip service to women these days, but it sounds like the only ones who are going to change are the women because they will be more included, but the people who were included will stay as they were. But what actually has to happen is that societal change means that relations between women and men have to change. The relations between majority and minority has to change. A society is not stronger than the way it treats its minorities. Democracy is more than majoritarian rule. The majority should decide, but there should also be institutional and practical, real-life respect for the role of minorities. How that is managed will differ from society to society. There is not one model, one size fits all, but it's important to be aware of that fact. We have also taken a role as Norway in the active promotion of human rights defenders. The human rights defenders are often themselves easily targets of attack. And we have to identify and give specific support to the people we identify as human rights defenders, human rights activists, and give them the protection they need in order to be able to go on with their inspirational work. I think some people believe that you can do the formal political change from one system to another and then do everything else afterwards, once you're settled in. I disagree with that. I think experience suggests that inclusion must happen while transitioning, not after transitioning. The reason I say it that way is that if a transition which seems to be a democratic revolt just ends up as a regime, as a elite change, you may easily end up reproducing many of the elements of repressions that was there in place. You just change one elite with another. So a genuine democratic transition has to be a democratic transition that also broadens the scope of who is involved. That means that people who were not used to listening to other voices that sounded like their own have to open up. And it also means that people who have not been used to practicing participation has to learn the tools of participation, which is more than the ballot box. How do you actually make your voice heard? What do you actually do when you organize? Just having the right to organize does not mean that you know how to organize. And it's very important, and I hope that this panel and the discussion we will have in this room, among the panel, with you and with everybody else in cyberspace who are now on Trygve, #Trygve, should be to see what can we learn from the examples that are out there. We have people from government, people from civil society, people from international organizations involved here, and I will not say very much more at the beginning, but start by giving the floor to the first speaker, which now is Her Excellency Ms. Maria Otero, Under Secretary of State for Democracy and Global Affairs, United States. Maria Otero is a good friend of Norway. We have a global dialogue which we cherish with you, the US, through you. Maria Otero has worked for empowerment of the poor and of women since her university days. In her present position as Under-Secretary of State, she has made her business not only to promote free and fair elections, but also to help create transparent governments and civil societies with free access to information. She has participated in this symposium the last 2 years. Please, Maria.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Espen. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you, Minister Eide, for this wonderful opportunity to participate. As you said, this is my 3rd year of participating. This is actually one of my favorite events in this UNGA week because it really allows us to have a thoughtful discussion with people that have been working on these important issues. Not to take time away from speaking, but I will just clarify that my title, as if these bureaucratic things were important, has been changed, and I only mention that because it reflects a very important change that Secretary Clinton has undertaken in the organization of the Department of State. I am now the Undersecretary of Civilian Security, Democracy, and Human Rights. And by civilian security, Secretary Clinton puts under one hat or one undersecretariat all those pieces of the Department of State that in one way or another can help governments protect their citizens and can help governments create more just societies. So that all of these pieces, from our help to improve law enforcement and security pieces, to our work against violent extremism, all the way to our work in supporting human rights defenders and in providing humanitarian aid, that whole spectrum of activity that is necessary when one looks precisely at the issue that we're talking about, is now part of what, really the central part of what I work on. So for that reason, it's worth mentioning that this is now my responsibilities. And so it means that really in this areas of transition, we have been quite engaged at the department. And we are noting that, of course, the many challenges that countries face as they're moving towards democratic governance is quite astounding, and it has laid bare, as we see, that democracies, in fact, require a lot more than elections. In fact, societies need to overcome the throes of important challenges as they transition into a democracy and that is going to survive and that is going to be sustainable. It means, we know, the cultivation and the evolution of their institutions. These are institutions and processes that are going to be essential to advance the rights of all. I think we have been seeing in the last couple of years that democracy is messy and hard work. Secretary Clinton at one point said that no democracy is perfect. In fact, our founders were smart enough to enshrine in our founding documents the idea that we had to keep moving forward towards a more perfect union. Because after all, democracies rely on the wisdom and the judgment of flawed human beings. So I think we see this as it's evolving, and we see that the pace and the nature of the transitions that we're seeing, whether they are in the Middle East or in North Africa, vary, and they vary depending on the experience and on the history and on the character of each different country. We have developed an approach for working with each country and for supporting them in their transition. And we have tailored this approach in order to fit the specific characteristics of each country. But beneath that approach, we maintain three things that are absolutely crucial as one moves forward towards creating a democratic system. Of course, the first one is prioritizing the importance of the universal human rights values that we believe are at the key of any democracy, and reaffirming the beliefs that these are absolutely essential for any political and economic success to take place in a country. Upholding those fundamental values of freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, the types of freedoms that we are also familiar with from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is one essential piece that can't be compromised. The second one is we advocate for a very strong role for civil society in being engaged in a very inclusive way in the democratic processes and in the way in which it operates. And by civilian society, we mean organizations that operate outside of government and that advocate or advance or train or in one way or another assist in this process of building democracy. And the third one, which already has been mentioned and which is so important here, is to promote an enhanced role for women and for ethnic and religious minorities in a country. So clearly this area, if it's not addressed from the very beginning, again, echoing what you have said, it becomes really very, very difficult to move forward. And we'll discuss this quite a bit more. Despite the recent violence that we have seen and the problems that we are all envisioning, we still believe that there is certainly a case for optimism in the Arab awakening. I think we see that transitional governments in the Middle East are taking steps towards fundamental freedoms. We can see examples emerging in many of the countries, and I won't go into all of the examples, but for example, if we look at Tunisia, Tunisia was the first to join the Coalition for Internet Freedom. Internet freedom is one area where freedom of expression has been compromised in many, many countries around the world. So these become themselves symbols of underlying fundamental values that countries are holding up. Libya held its fair and free election in more than 40 years. And it was an election that in my last visit there looked like it was going to be almost impossible to carry out. And in fact, as we were discussing earlier, it is an election that demonstrates that a country that has not had experience in that area was able to move that forward. Egypt has scaled back the powers of the military and has curbed the use of extrajudicial and arbitrary detentions, again, moving towards a direction that is important. And we have seen in most of these countries movements towards transitional justice initiatives. These all have to be sustained, they have to be encouraged, they have to be advanced, but they are really the beginning of causes that bring us optimism. Now, if we look at the flip side of this, there are also threats, and there are also some difficult problems that are threatening the fundamental freedoms in the Middle East. We see, for example, the rise of restrictive laws that are not only limiting publications or limiting the content of publications, but they are restricting the space in which civil society can operate and not enabling civil society to develop in a way that it can be that leg in the three-legged stool that's essential in order to move forward an effective democracy. We are hearing murmurs, and we are concerned about the recent attacks that could really bring in draconian emergency laws, some of which countries like Egypt have lived with for many years. So we are seeing some troubling provisions in some constitutional articles and constitutions that are being written that in fact would subordinate women from the very beginning or would marginalize certain religious minorities. So all of these are very important items to take into account. One other country in transition that is important to note is Burma. And I think as we look at Burma, I was on the Thai-Burma border quite recently, And I was working primarily in trying to address the needs of the ethnic minorities that are certainly part of the enormous challenge that the government has as it moves towards integrating that country into a transition to democracy. And the opportunities to speak with the ethnic minorities, I think, verify the point that you made, that it is really from the very beginning that these ethnic minorities, their representatives, have to be part of the discussions, the political discussions in the government, the creation of the institutions that are also going to meet their needs and address their work. So this idea of inclusive political dialogue sounds very easy, but it's one that is particularly difficult. And in a case of Burma, many of the human rights defenders that were working with these ethnic minorities were working outside of the country of Burma. And so their own ability to then reintegrate themselves into the Burmese society becomes very important. So these, I think, are some of the important issues that we need to take into account. In all of this, I think we also need to look at what mechanisms exist that allow us to help integrate these minorities or help bring them together in order to overcome either sectarian divisions or other types of divisions. In Burma, interestingly, the concept of demining, of addressing landmines, is one issue that brings together people because it's such a threat that cuts across ethnic groups or even the society at large. So we were undertaking efforts to address the issue of demining in all of the border areas that are quite threatening for the populations. And if the Burmese government can work on this, this also becomes a way of engaging them. Now, just in closing, there's a great deal more that can be said, and we will have a good discussion. But I would say that there are many examples of ways in which we can work and we can support governments that are in transition. It's my firm belief that the international community has to show an unwavering support for the fundamental freedoms, that regardless of what condition or state transitions to democracy are in, these are not compromising ones. These are not that we must in any way sacrifice. And we must remain absolutely engaged with the human rights defenders in these countries who are operating through civil society in order to really be able to make sure that that critical role of a strong democracy is played out. So let me stop there and leave those ideas on the table. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria, and congratulations on your new role, new title. That sounds very good. Let's hope you continue for a long while doing that, given where we are now in the American cycle. Then I would turn to Luisa Bor, International Crisis Group, former High Commissioner, distinguished representative of everything we believe in here. And I'm really happy that we have you on the panel. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Minister, and thank you for including me in this event. I will be very brief in my remarks because the gist of what I want to say, I think, is represented here, which is, I think, as we approach the efforts we want to make to support countries in transition, our mantra, our guiding principle is that we should be very modest and, for once, not claim to be in the lead. I think the lead is going to be represented by the other panelists. They are the ones who have to tell us how we can help. I think we have to approach these transitions that are culturally and to a large extent politically very foreign to us, even though grounded in the same aspirations for the protection of all human rights, civil and political rights, economic and social rights. I think we're going to have to step back and take the lead from those who are fighting their own battles on the ground and support them in a deferential and modest way, which is not in our temperament, I think, many of us. So I think my first message is exactly that. It's going to be a cultural challenge for us, I think, to step back, take a deep breath, and try to understand the very different environment in which democracies are taking roots, in an environment in which they were suppressed. They were suppressed before our very eyes, and We weren't that much in the lead in the transformation. These were very indigenous movements, and I think now that they're taking roots, we should respect that aspect of these transitions. I think we should also be very wary and avoid a kind of political tourism in which we can move around the world with our ready-made answers to the challenges that are being faced, I think, before these countries that have to manage their own pluralism, their own, for instance, varied opinions about the role of religion in the setting up of their democracies. So, again, I want to stress that I'm delighted that we have panelists here who I think are going to have a lot more to say to us, and we should take the lead from them. I'll just say a couple of things on the general theme of protection of minorities and the advancement of the participation of women. First, I think we should recognize that the transformation of women worldwide moving from essentially the confines of the private lives into the public sphere is still very much a work in progress in our own more mature democracies. We should be extremely wary about claiming that we've accomplished the full integration and participation and inclusion of women in public life, and therefore we have a lot to teach. Again, I think we should recognize that certainly when I look at my own career and where we come from, again, in this transformation, we're not quite there yet. And in fact, some of our younger colleagues moving into this environment may speed things up. We may be very surprised in a few years to find out how quickly they've caught up and that the burden is on us, the more mature democracies, for instance, to have the kind of participation in parliaments, in public life, that they may very well be able to achieve much more readily than we have. I'll just flag two things that I think are relevant. First of all, my own background is very much in the law. I am absolutely persuaded that constitutional entitlements, legal entitlements, are not sufficient to guarantee the flourishing of rights. They're not sufficient, but they're absolutely necessary. And so I'll say a few things about that. There were a couple of events this week that are very related to our topic, and one in particular, which I addressed in this room a few months ago, which is the rule of law. As you know, the General Assembly this week held a high-level segment on the rule of law. This had to be the high watermark of rhetorical endorsement for this wonderful concept. What it's going to yield in practice, I'm holding my breath. I hope you are too. But I think as this is now anchored, at least in United Nations commitments, we have to push the system to deliver on the rule of law. And that applies to donor countries who will be very heavily solicited, I think, to support rule of law initiatives. We should continue to stress that the rule of law is not the same thing as law enforcement. It is not a recipe to put more money into policing and prisons and repressive systems. It will be a very popular concept for those leaders who like very much rule by law, any law, as long as they have the capacity to enforce it. I think we're going to have to keep pushing for a much richer understanding of the rule of law, which is fundamentally based on the principle of equal protection and equal benefit of the law. And if we can advance that idea, women will do well, unpopular minorities in democracies will be protected. So now that this is now anchored in United Nations programming blueprint, I think we should capitalize on it and try to advance that. The second issue I'd like to mention, and Vidar, I'm sure, will want to echo that, is we had an event this week launching this new report on elections. This was a global commission, it was called the Global Commission on Elections, Democracy and Security, chaired by Kofi Annan, which produced a report dealing with the concept of elections with integrity, looking at the entire electoral cycle, and specifically on the question of participation of minorities, those who tend to be disenfranchised, I think there's a useful launch of a conversation there, including on the vexing question of participation of women in quotas. I know it's a controversial issue. I personally happen to think that to the extent that we believe in substantive equality as opposed to formal equality, depending on the environments, what are called quotas, that at other times in other contexts were called affirmative action, any kind of initiative that can address historical deficiencies in a transitional way are helpful. What this report recommends on this particular issue, having looked at the literature regarding the participation of women and the use of quotas, is that quotas should be encouraged, but with a sunset clause. That is, not giving a signal that this is an entrenched mode of participation in a democracy. And they are examples where having quotas in place for a short time is just enough to kickstart the participation of women. And after that, just trust me, we don't need quotas, but sometimes we need them just to get a foot in the door. Now, there's some who will then claim there's a backlash and there's an assumption that women are there just because of this preferential treatment. The answer to that, of course, is not only to open the door to women's participation, but also to insist that when they walk in, they be given quality work to do, not stereotypical, marginal work, but that they be given access not just to a seat in parliament, but to ministerial position in significant roles, commensurate to their talent and what they have to contribute, which is, in any event, on par, I think, with everybody else. So I just wanted to flag these two issues, rule of law and elections. I think elections are going to be very critical in societies in transition. There's a lot of materials, I think, in this report talking about the integrity of elections that I hope would be helpful to societies in transition being inclusive. So again, I want to stress that in my view, the combination of constitutional and legal guarantees plus methods of inclusive participation in democratic life, if we get that right, I think we're on the right track to open up space for minorities, women, human rights defenders, and others to not only to be protected, but to contribute to the transformations of their countries. But at the end of the day, we have to hear from them. That's why I'm here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Louise. Elections with integrity, rule of law, extremely important points. I'm convinced we'll come back to them. Now I'm delighted to introduce Ms. Esra Abdel Fattah. As we heard, the co-founder of the April 6th movement in Egypt. Very important voice, and we are so happy to have you with us here. Floor is yours.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity to be with you, and thank you for participating and coming to listen to us. Maybe I want to start my words by that I believe that the revolution never go backwards. This is a word for William Henry Seward, which I believe in despite of all challenges we faces in our countries, but I think that is our revolution will not go back in any way. And of course, when we started our revolution and we are preparing or working for it from several years before revolution, we are understanding that is we facing very long road and that we cannot find that is we will have democracy after stepping down Mubarak or the dictatorial in any countries. That is, we will face very long step or very long phase to have a real democracy. And we also understand and believe that is, as you, Mrs. Otero said, that is democracy is not elections. We need more steps before election to have a real democracy. We need to have educations. We need to have laws. We need to have institution, independent institution to find a real election. It's the last step of democracy. Also, I want to say that is we focused as activists or revolutionary power from years before 2011 just to stop down this regime. We focus how we can mobilize people and encourage people to go to the street to say we need to get rid of this regime. I think we didn't have any opportunity to educate ourselves, to educate ourselves, to be ready to be in the power in the days after Mubarak stepping down, and we find ourselves in the parliament or as a ministers. We are focusing on to stepping down this regime. And we cannot, at this time of revolution, we didn't see that is only we stay for 18 days in the square and we find that is Mubarak is stepping down. We cannot recognize it. If you can recognize, we can educate ourselves and preparing ourselves for election after 18 days or for transitional period. But also we have another powers like Muslim Brotherhood, like Islamist power, who are very organized for over many years. So I think it's something normal to find that the Muslim Brotherhood is the only power ready to take the place of the regime. So we face like a normal step. If we can analyze what happened and what happens in all the Arab Spring, we can say that is after this stepping down, all the Arab Spring will face the face of Islamists. And the challenge now, how long will be this face? The challenge now, how long we can have a constitution, how long we have a real institution, independent institution to control the upcoming elections, how we can find the constitution secure and guarantee the rights of minorities, women's, Copts, and whatever, how we can find the laws, the rule of law. The rule of law in this step is so important. How we can find a law that can secure that all the political powers have the same opportunity to participate in the upcoming elections. We face many challenges from the first start, from the time of stepping down the regime. We find that the Supreme Council of Army have the ruling the country of this transitional period, and we are not satisfied of this misleadership happened for more than 1 year for this transitional period. We are working starting from the step down Mubarak to have the constitution first. But the Supreme of the SCAF in Egypt insist on to have like modifications of constitution and to have election first and after this constitution. So the logic steps happened in this transitional period. If the more important things that we face now, I think we have 1 year for nothing to happen. For a real democracy transitional 1 year, we didn't make anything real to have very democratic transitional period. And also they always try to say that is to destroy our reputations, to say that we are agents and we are working with others foreign groups, and that is we are specific on 6th April movement and another civil society. And you know that is many civil societies and many NGOs in Egypt in the transitional period are closed, and they have to try to destroy the image of civil society all this period. So we have many challenges all over this period. And also we can find now that is the Muslim Brotherhood or the people who are now in power, they are not have a clear plan to have a real independent institution at this time. We need a real independent institution to control the upcoming election. We will have a referendum even after 1 month, and after 2 months or 3 months we have election. Who the institution will control this? We are very worried about to find ourselves in the same position before. That is our competitions. It's like the one who controls the game, the one who controls the election is the same as our competitions in the election. And this is what happens. It is our real fear, not our real fear that we find that is Muslim Brotherhood in many positions. It's normal that we find that is the president is Muslim Brotherhood. We find that is he wants the people who trust them to implement his objectives or his visions. But the fear that is in the time of the election, we find that the Muslim Brotherhood are the competition of the civic war, the revolution war, and at the same time, the High Committee of Election are the Muslim Brotherhood also, as like NDP before, or the ex-regime. That is our real fear. Now, and also we now find that some draft comes from inside the Constitution, one draft of the section of rights and duties. We find only one article mentioned women's rights. One article for all this section mentions that women should have the same rights as men in political and social and economic rights. Full stop. Nothing else. In all these part, it's a draft, and we have many, we said that in TV and social media, and we are not agree about these items, and we need to change this article, and we make pressure for changing. It's like a draft, but we are worried about this draft is how the people inside this assembly agree to come or to put these drafts out without revisions, without all the people are agree about these items. So we have fears about the right of minorities and about rights of women inside this constitution. We are fearing about all the process, because before Morsi being the president, he said he will remaking up this assembly, but we cannot find that has happened. And also we find that is, I was in his speech yesterday with the Egyptians. He said that is, I cannot do anything for this. It's a matter of law, and I cannot interfere. So what is the solution now? That is, we find that is, we are not agree about the draft is coming from inside this assembly. So I think, because I don't have to be long, I think that is, we need now, even we have all these challenges, but I am optimistic about the future of all the Arab Spring, not only Egypt. We suffered and struggled for years until Mubarak stepped down. So I think it's a normal thing that is, we have our faces as challenges and we can overcome, but we should monitor very carefully what happened. We should advise, we should criticize, we should mobilize people to refuse the articles coming out. We should compare what happened inside this constitution with the international measurements in any treatment over the world. We say that is, we need to put this constitution matching with the standards in international society. Not only us, we should do that. All the international society, we do that. If we are supporting the rule or the freedom and the democracy and the justice, the dignity, we should not support it in only your country, but all over the world. We should say and mention that is, the Arab Spring have many fears or worries about this article, and this, how we can put these discussions or this highlighting all over the media to say that is, this article or this constitution missing 1, 2, 3, 4, and they should have after this revolution. We should promote and support the values you believe in all over the world, not only in your country. I think that we have a message from this revolution. We have a message for this Arab Spring, that is, we need to believe in people. We need to change that all over the world, that only the relationship between the countries or between the foreigners and the Arab Spring is the leaders from these countries deal with the leader for this country and to change the interest between them. But we need now to change this concept. We need to say that is the main important power in every country is the power of the people. How we can exchange experience between different peoples in different countries and to support the rights all over the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Esra, for those very important words, and I think both for pointing out the challenges and also ending on an optimistic note, which I think is exactly where we want to be at this stage. Before we go on, I'll just remind you, #TrygveLi, there is active live on Twitter on this conference, and thank you for all of those already participating. Then I would turn to Ms. Ala Murabit. founder of the Voice of Libyan Women, a strong voice in revolution and post-revolution and in the midst of transition. Again, we are delighted to have you with us, and we're looking forward to hear your words, please.
Hello. First, I'd like to say thank you for having me, and thank you all for coming. I know this has been a very hectic week for all of you. I'm going to go back a little bit and make this a bit more of my personal story and my understanding of, I guess, the transition in Libya. I was born and raised in what I think is considered internationally as one of the most successful democracies, and that's Canada. When I was 14 years old, I moved back to Libya. And I had never lived in Libya, despite the fact that I was raised in a culturally sound family. I was not prepared for the change. I had grown up in a society where, you went out and played regularly. We had internet at home, so that was a plus. And cell phones did not cost 1,000 dinars. So going to Libya was, more than anything else, an extreme shock for me, despite how prepared and how excited I was to go at the time, because my only recollection of it was getting a lot of ice cream from my relatives. So upon arriving, I found that it was very difficult for me to integrate into society. I had different ideas, different opinions, was much more vocal than the Libyan girl should be. And of course, I did not understand the way the country worked. It was foreign to me. There was importance put on social structures and tribes and families that I did not necessarily understand, having been raised so far away from my own. So I became, unlike most people my age, immersed in understanding the tribal structure of Libya, immersed in understanding how these relationships work. In my own hometown of Zawiya, which is about 30 minutes away from the capital, I now can name every single tribe and kind of its importance in its generally understood, I guess, importance. And this is key. And I think that's one of the main differences between Libya and other countries that have gone through, and I dislike the term, the Arab Spring, so I'm going to say have gone through transition, but is two main things. It's institutional framework and its social framework. Institutionally, we have no institutions. We never have. We had Gaddafi, who was the leader, nothing more, no president, no real title. We never had a real government. We do not have institutions, which is very much unlike other countries going through this transition. We've never had civil society. Civil society meant that the regime was not doing its job, and that was not allowed. So these things are all very new to us. Our transition is very much from the rubble. We have really no idea what we're doing most of the time. Following that is our social framework. We are 6 million people, give or take, and very much built up on traditional tribal family lines. That's not to say that tribes are bad. And I always read this in the newspapers. It's very tribal. And tribes always sound like a very negative thing when you think about it. But in Libya, when we're discussing majority and minority, tribes are both good in many ways and bad in many ways, as are all things. The majority is helped by the social framework of the country. Very much helped. That's the reason we've had a lot less violence than many would expect with the amount of weapons we have in the country, is because most of the time this is somebody you are in some way related to, or whether it's through blood or through marriage, or a family which your family may know very well or may not know but have heard of, etc. The downside to the social framework of Libya is the effect it has on minorities. Those who are seen to be part of the Libyan identity, without question, are helped. Those whose nationality has some debate are not. And we see that very clearly in numerous conflicts that are going on through Libya, particularly with the Tuareg and with the Tabu. After this, we come to my point of interest, which is women in Libya. And this is where I think I absolutely agree with the speakers before me when they said that transition must be rooted mainly in social and cultural change. Going back to Ms. Arbour's point on quotas, our organization was a staunch supporter of quotas. when the election law was written in January of this year, it stated that there would be a 10% quota, and we went out and protested. We said it has to be higher. 10% is silly. The Libyan population is more than 50% women. They listened to us, invited us to a few meetings, and we hoped we're coming out with a very sound, positive note. Instead, removed the quota altogether and said, you're right, women are more than 50%. You need to play fair. So nobody gets a quota. If you get elected, you get elected. This obviously did not work either, and we went out and argued for quotas again. And this time we thought, well, we need public support. So we went out looking for your average Libyan who supported a quota. And it was women, more than men, who were like, quota? I don't need a quota. Women shouldn't get quotas. We need to earn our seats. And you would explain, no, we're trying to level the playing field, that for generations and due to culture and due to all these things has put women very much in the back seat politically in Libya, not only because of our culture, but also because of the fact that women are not as economically successful as men in Libya. And you need that kind of money to be able to run a campaign. Women don't have the social connections, those elite, I guess you would say, social connections to garner them a seat politically. And instead, we kept getting pushback on this. I do strongly agree that you need affirmative action within the transition period. But more importantly than that, I have to agree that it needs to be a cultural and societal shift. There has to be some sort of education in transition. There has to be a general understanding. Transitions cannot be rooted, as speakers before me have said, solely in legislation and in constitution. Transitions must be rooted in the people themselves. Democracy must be, and unfortunately it is a fact, is as all good things are, it's going to be messy, it will take a lot of work, but it needs to be taught. We did not wake up after 42 years and suddenly say, oh, we've figured it all out, thanks guys. Gaddafi's gone, we're going to have amazing schools, hospitals, women are going to run and be elected freely, minorities are going to be respected. That did not happen. It did not happen in the United States of America, in Norway. It will not happen in Libya. I want to touch base on one final thing, and that is the term Islamists. I don't like that term either. But there has been a lot of talk about extremism in the Arab Spring. And despite some recent occurrences in Libya, I think we have to also be very aware that Islam is a religion of 1.6 billion people. And there is a very loud, very vocal, very focused minority, but that is what they are. They are a minority. And I think when Ms. Otero said that we have to support these democracies, that would be my number one suggestion, is international encouragement, unbiased encouragement is key. We cannot keep going into situations and say, well, there's going to be extremism here, so we have to be careful. But instead, supporting these transitions wholeheartedly and saying, you know what, sure, there are going to have different elements. Every country will. Every country does, including, as you so well said, the States. And hopefully you guys will be catching up to us soon. But we have to respect that. And there has to be unbiased encouragement. And yeah, that's all I have to say.
Thank you so much, Ala, for those inspiring words. I think you are so right in pointing out that these kind of change has to happen at all levels. And when you have a change in the hierarchies in politics between ruler and ruled, this also has to reflect in families and in society and relations between men, women, father, son, mother, daughter, mother, son. All these relationships will have to change. And speaking as we are, I think Norway now is the second best gender equality index country, which we're proud of, although we would like to be number one, of course. We still are extremely aware that it's a very long way to go also for us. And we're still working, and we'll probably go on working for a long time. So, you know, these are long-term transition processes. In respect for our principle that both genders should be represented, I think it's fair that we also allow a male voice on the panel towards the end. And we're really happy to have with us Vidar Helgesen, who is the Secretary General of IDEA, an international organization based in Stockholm, actively involved worldwide in democracy promotion. Please, Vidar.
Thank you very much, Espen, and thank you for this expression of inclusion. And, I will have three main points. Firstly, that inclusion is the change. It's not the end product of change. Secondly, that time is the friend of inclusion, and time pressure is the enemy of inclusion. And thirdly, that the international community needs to be on the side of time and therefore of inclusion. On the first point, inclusion is the change. The uprisings that we've seen in North Africa have been uprisings against entire architectures of political, economic, and social exclusion. And therefore, in dismantling and rebuilding the architectures of those countries, inclusion needs to be there from the outset, as Espen said. That goes for women, it goes for minorities, and it also goes for that vast majority. Almost 60% of the population are below 25, and therefore the young people that were often at the forefront of the revolutions also need to be participating. There's another aspect of inclusion that I'd also like to point out, because it's often forgotten when the international community engages with these processes, and that's the role of political opposition. The old systems were elitist systems, no role for political opposition, and if that is replaced by winner-takes-all politics, you'll have a real problem achieving true change. The Global Commission report that Louise mentioned makes a point of democracy as a mutual security system, which means that those who win elections will still have constraints, and those who lose elections will still be protected, and next time round they will have an opportunity to win. The second point, time as a friend of inclusive participation. There is often in transitions a rush to elections, and quick elections can be successful. The Libyan example is remarkable, at least at the level of technical conduct of elections. It still remains to be seen whether inclusion and real proper participation will be the outcome. But you need time to make elections support democracy, support development, support human rights. The Commission report also points to that. Elections can be for good or for less good. The establishment of independent electoral management bodies, as mentioned in Egypt, also requires time. There's always often a rush to redesign constitutions. And of course, if you rush to redesign constitutions, it's impossible to have a truly inclusive process. And that's what we too often see. Not enough time for a broad, inclusive national dialogue on the basics of the state formation, the new state formation, and on nurturing a democratic culture. And that time pressure often tilts the playing field in favor of old elites or new elites, to the detriment of civil society, of women, of youth. I see what we're seeing in Egypt with the young people that camped in Tahrir and demonstrated. It's evident they need time, and they express a need for time to shape political forces if they want to establish political parties. All these things do take time. And in that regard, there's also an expectations management dimension to these transitions. People often have enormous expectations that change will happen really quickly, that economic development and jobs will be there tomorrow or next week. If the political process is rushed, that just adds to that expectations growth, and the following disillusionment can trigger destabilizing forces or extremism. Finally, the international community needs to be on the side of time and on the side of inclusion. And too often we see the international community contributing to a rush, using elections as exit strategies more than as true expressions of democratic processes. There's also a very strong focus, naturally so, on supporting political stability in turbulent transitions. But too often that comes to the detriment of building pluralism and building diversity in the political process that is needed to build long-term stability. And this leads me to my conclusion, which is that democracy is good for stability in the long run. the process of democratizing is inherently destabilizing because it's about altering power relations in society. And the trick is really to come through that process and build a new stability. And you can't get there unless you take the time needed to really secure inclusion in the political process. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vidar. IDEA is actively engaged in this and is has gained a lot of experience, which I think is highly relevant for the topic we're discussing. It's very good to have you with us. Now we have come to the time where we will start taking questions. And as I said, there is an opportunity to do it digitally. I can so far see a lot of comments, but no real questions. So we will start with some more analog questions in the room. The first person I would challenge to make a comment is Anthony Triolo from the International Center for Transitional Justice, please.
Sorry. As you know, the ICTJ firmly believes that in order to build more stable and democratic futures, it's important to address the past and the legacy of mass abuses. And if we look at women in particular, we know that they're not a monolithic group, and they experience violations differently according to their identities, whether it's class issues or religion or political affiliation. And that, to some degree, I think influences their justice priorities. For example, the types of reparations they would like to receive, the type of acknowledgement that they would like to receive, and so forth. Now, if we look at the issue more broadly, and we know that violations themselves, affect people differently across sectarian lines, what I would like to ask the panel is, how do you address these violations in a way that don't further sort of entrench sectarian divisions and sort of genuinely respect everyone's experiences? So that's what I would like to pose.
Well, I will later collect some questions, but since that was the direct question and since I challenged you to ask, does anybody want to pick up on that one in the panel? Luis, maybe?
This is a very large question. I mean, all I could say is I think there's enough of a movement that has challenged the prevailing culture of impunity that has lasted for a very long time, a movement towards accountability and so on. Again, I think I have to stress that the only chances of success is for these movements to be very indigenous, for societies to make their own choices about how to address their past, whether it's simply through the acknowledgement of the truth or higher forms of accountability. I think we have to be, again, very deferential to the time it's going to take, the time frame, the requisite amount of historical distance to appreciate a country's history. I think the ownership of a country's history belongs primarily to them, and we need to be supportive and put, I think, at their disposal the literature, the research that has been done, the new ideas. But it's, I think, unwise in the extreme, again, to peddle particular models for societies that face many, many challenges, and understanding their past is critical for embracing their future, but at what pace and, again, through which resources and under whose leadership and so on, I think is very much for them to determine.
There's a whole other issue here that I'm not sure if it fits. It does fit in responding to your question a little bit. And it also goes back to the difference that Luis made between the rule of law and law enforcement. Because one of the pieces that we haven't discussed here in the transition issue, and that relates to women and to minorities, is the means through which these new governments are putting together security institutions that provide security and protection for citizens, that are going to be ones that in fact are going to work for the citizens and not for a repressive state. Whether you take Tunisia or you take Egypt, the police forces themselves are forces that have never really seen themselves as protectors of the citizens that they should be protecting. how you make those changes, how it is that you take, and I've sat with the Minister of Interior in Tunisia, and we've discussed these issues of how you take a force that was trained and developed to be able to repress and to suppress and to violate the rights of people into one that both culturally, institutionally, is shifted completely to become one that protects the citizens. This becomes a really important component of addressing this question of protection, and it relates specifically to the issue of women. Because if you don't address this buildup of this part of, you could call it the law enforcement side of this, in a way in which you incorporate into their capacity building, into their training, issues that are related to gender and issues that are related to minorities, you will have increased violence still coming from the state as they try to address these issues. So just bringing this question, which is a very integral part of building up a society that is democratic, is very important, and it is an issue that we need to look at from the perspective of how women are treated themselves, because this is a huge issue.
Thank you very much. From public control to public service.
Yeah.
Now I have a couple of questions. I recognize Heidi Taksdal Skjeseth here in the front. She needs a microphone. There, yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for coming here. My first question is to Alam Rabit about the current attempts by the Libyan government to dissolve the militias and the importance of this, and if it's doable, if you think so. And also, since everyone raised the importance of changing personal and cultural relations between men and women, could you both, Abdel Fattah and Rabit, please just briefly say if you have seen any changes of this and how that will come about? Thank you.
Thank you. We'll now collect a few questions of more people, and then we have Ambassador Rasool. If you like to take from South Africa.
No, thanks. Thanks very much. I think that particularly on the issue of women and the inclusion in society, I think that South Africa is at the happy stage where today 44% of our parliamentarians are women and 43% of our cabinet would be women. And it's partly a tribute, or mostly a tribute, to the very integral role that women played in the liberation struggle themselves. And secondly, it's a tribute to not only the establishment of quotas or affirmative action, but also underpinning it with institutions such as the Commission for Gender Equality, and now ushering in next year a gender equality bill that will be a law that underpins some of those issues that will now take what we've achieved in the public space into the private boardrooms as well, into decision-making fora. I think the most important thing that I would want to just get a response on is the issue of something that South African women got right. To be able to build, to get that kind of situation is about organizing power and not collecting sympathy. Yeah. I think the important point about it is, in organizing power, what attempts are being made to appeal to women as women that transcends the appellation of women as tribal members, as members of different religions, as members of different madahib within religions, as members, as housewives, and a range of different things, because those are the other identities that a woman's identity compete with. So that was the second thing I just want to say is that particularly in the countries of the Middle East and North African region, we can speak about culture, we can speak about tradition and politics and all of those kind of things, but unless there's also a theological transition that is broader, we will not undermine those fundamental belief structures and interpretations of the Quran and the Sunnah that continue to make women apologize for their space, or minorities not have their rights, or democracy not being entrenched as far and as fast as possible. So I thought I just want to gather some responses to those as it pertains in some of the MENA regions.
Thank you, Ambassador. We take one more question here before we return to the panel.
Thank you. Thank you. My name is Khalid Mansour. I'm the Director of Communications for UNICEF, but I'm also an Egyptian, so I'm wearing the latter hat and asking my question. I think first on the optics, I cannot but observe the absence of government representatives on the table. I think a few government representatives from the Global South, I'm sorry, on the table from Tunisia and from South Africa, etc. I know it's a very busy week, but I think it sends a message that we have the civil society, but we don't have the governments. Maybe it's a point of our priorities. And don't get me wrong, as an Arab, as a man, as Egyptian, as a Muslim, I'm actually proud and empowered to be represented by Allah and Israel. So I have a couple of comments, questions. First, on the political tourism mentioned by Louise Harper, and it's very timely. I just got a call yesterday from a friend in Egypt telling me, "Can you tell them to stop sending us missions from Eastern Europe? I am not going to meet another Czech." With all due respect to Czechs and to Polish, etc., because culturally, religiously, historically, it's really different here, and it's not really helping us. And for them, for many people engaged in the Middle East, it seems to me that democratization is not the kind of ready-made prescription you will get from Dwayne Reed at the corner, but rather like the old-time medicine in which you have to put the ingredients together. Secondly, I'm concerned about a discussion which is focused on human rights to the exclusion, in a way, of economic rights. Let's remember that the slogans of what happened in Tunisia and in Egypt and elsewhere is also related to, as they said, عيش حرية كرامة اجتماعية, or bread, freedom, and social dignity. So it started with bread, and I'm afraid if you focus it on human rights, you might end up in the quicksand of identity politics, and we have seen where that can take us in the last couple of weeks. And finally, the ruling elite now in the Middle East and North Africa, including President Morsi, are people who have great suspicions about the West. Because until very recently, there were people that were not met by the West, while people who put them in prison were actually welcomed in Jersey, in Europe, and elsewhere. This is not an issue about realpolitik, and we have to teach them that states change their interest, blah, blah, blah. It's an issue of trust. There is a lack of trust, and I think there is a need to work on trust with the new ruling elite in the Middle East and North Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much for 3 challenging questions. Who would like to start? Yeah, Ala.
I will start. I'll answer all 3, not as much yours, but I will start with the question on militias and the difference in cultural and societal dynamic between men and women. Starting with militias, I'm sure that everybody has heard Libya has made the news recently regarding our issue with militias. What did not make the news as much as the unfortunate passing of Ambassador Stevens was the 30,000 to 40,000 people who marched in Benghazi. This march, unfortunately, was not on every front page newspaper and was spoken about a lot less by the international community. And I think what that showed our government, and I'm thankful and I completely appreciate the people of Benghazi for having gone out and doing that, because they did take back the revolution in a way. What it showed our government and the international community is that this minority of very powerful, groups do not have a right to be there. And the fact that march then led to them entering into some of the brigades and kicking out some of these militias was also very symbolic. I think it gave a push to our newly elected government, which has had a lot on its plate, and I do not envy them their position at all, but to really address security, because speaking very frankly, that is our biggest, I would say, challenge. in Libya. Our biggest obstacle will be our security, without doubt. And do I think it's possible? I don't know. I genuinely don't know if it will be possible to ensure that all these militias are disbanded. I do know that the fact that it has been done at all is is a step in the right direction, because it's something that no government, our Minister of Interior, former Minister of Interior himself said, I cannot control them. So the fact that the government is now taking responsibility for state security, I think is a step in the right direction. And I welcome it, and I hope it works out. And from what I understand, our head of GNC will be here tonight, Mr. Mgerif, at 5:30. So I think you should come back and ask him that same question. Make sure you get a really good answer out of him. In terms of change in culture and society, I have seen quite a bit. My dad actually is here. So, yeah. But I have seen a strong change in society and culture. And I think the reason that our organization has been successful in promoting that change is because we have focused a lot of our efforts on integrating men into the dialogue. It has never been women coming and saying, this is what we want, this is what we deserve, never trying to use sympathy, etc., but instead trying to shift the power because ultimately we're going to need to take some from them. Right? Like that goes without saying. And so putting them in a position where they want to give up that power, where they don't feel like this is something foreign that's been brought to them, and instead feel like they're part of the dialogue. So for us, a key ingredient was involving men and was ensuring that men were involved. Another key ingredient was actually taking back the interpretation of our religion in a way. And the reason I say that is because a lot of reasons and a lot of excuses made against women are not religiously, but more culturally based. They're not religious at all. Islam as a religion gives me all my rights. I've been raised by some of the most religious people you will ever meet, and yet I'm sitting here talking to you about politics and inclusion of women, etc. So what we ended up doing was, in order to discuss something as sensitive as domestic violence, which is a topic that is not necessarily discussed in our society, we utilized religion, and we made it an International Purple Scarf Day. And by doing that, by telling people, listen, religiously it's wrong, a lot more people were supportive. We had tried to do it only months earlier from a very scientific and dry way, and very few Libyans were quite supportive of it. So I think a lot of it is redefining, reinterpreting your religion, and I think that needs to be done throughout the world for Islam, because for thousands of years it's only been men who interpret it, and you just know that they're going to take what they like and leave what they don't. So I do think that women need to get involved in that. The last statement I actually wanted to make was about the international community. I agree with you in the sense that we see a lot of them now. But I also think that it's key to have the international community come to our countries in this time of transition. I don't think it's a good idea to say, well, where you're not helping us, don't come. The exact opposite. I think the fact that the international community is now, and more for the public than for the government, but this reintegration into the international community, particularly for a country like Libya, which was isolated for so long, is important. The fact that we have the international community not necessarily as, I'd say, encouraging us to make some of the right decisions is key, because as much faith as I have in my government and in Libyans, the fact of the matter is we have never done this before. So having examples that we can look at, even just as examples, I think is very important. And one would be the South African Women's Charter, which our organization actually implemented because of South Africa. So having those key things can help us in our own transitions. Just because they're there, it does not mean we have to use them. But I do appreciate having them there. Thank you.
Okay. Vidar Helgesen said, I think very correctly, that time is the friend of inclusion, but time is not the friend of this seminar, which concerns me, because there are a lot of questions that should be both asked and answered. I think we are closing to an end. I will give the panelists an opportunity to say one important thing, but not answer all questions, if you like. Or you can associate yourself with Allah if you like as well. Do you want to ask for quick?
Yeah, I just to mention something about the women's rights and about the lack of trust. The women's rights, I think, that is the culture and the traditionals in all the Arab Spring. I think it needs time. It depends on two fields. This change of these two fields needs a lot of time: education and media. We need to change the new generation coming, how to believe in women, how to find that women are equal to men. Women's trust is itself. They participated in the revolutions in front lines, not in backs. But we find after transitional period that is the society didn't believe in women. When we make assembly for changing the constitution, no women inside this assembly. We cannot appoint women and put it in the decision-making positions, and this is a traditional. So we need to work at it, but by long terms. We cannot change it at once. We can help to change it by the constitution and by the parties, but by the constitution and by the laws. But we need to work on it through the long term about education and the media. It's one thing. And the other thing about the religious or the freedom of religion. Yeah, okay. I need also to say that is we need to redefinitions what is the freedom of speech. We need to redefinitions it not only in our countries but all over the world. How we can respect each other, how we can respect our figures all over the world, how we can protect this reputation of this figure by laws, by international laws. The lack of trust, I think we need transparency. We need transparency for the relation, for the leadership. If we find this transparency, I think we cannot find that lack of trust. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being with us, and thank you for that. One important thing, Louise, just one.
Yeah, this is very frustrating because so many great issues are surfacing. I just want to say something about the South African model, where, Mr. Ambassador, you said to a large extent gender equality has been accomplished or attained because, or is moving in the right direction because women were part of the struggle. I think in the international environment, Resolution 1325 of the Security Council dealing with women in armed conflict refuses to celebrate the participation of women in struggles. It's an angelic view of women either as victims or as peacemakers. For women to obtain the kind of political power that we want them to obtain, I think it's critical that we recognize, encourage, even celebrate their full participation in what you call the struggle. Now, in armed conflict, it's pretty tough to preach that we should arm women, but that's the reality. Power comes from being taken, not given.
Maria, thank you.
Yes, thank you. I would say that from the perspective of the U.S. government, we will continue to support the processes of democracies that we are witnessing around the world, the Middle East and around the world. And we will continue to do this as supporters, as those that are, of course, giving the lead to the people of that country. But in that support, we will continue to uphold the fundamental freedoms that we think are essential. We will continue to criticize when those freedoms are constrained. We will continue to push for the important role of civil society, in particular in supporting minorities and women in particular. And we will support the very complex process of building institutions, of developing political parties and political systems, and in developing the processes that are needed in order for democracies to operate. We're very optimistic, because I think we do see, you've got it sitting here right at the table, that this will move forward, and we know that we're in for the long haul, and we will continue doing this work with a lot of commitment.
And thank you so much for that. That's a strong source of inspiration. Vidar, last point.
On the issue of political versus economic rights, I think we have to maintain that those are indivisible and universal at the level of principle, but also at the very practical level. The corrupted economy and corrupted politics have been so intertwined that you have to address both. And that I mean really both, not only civil and political rights, but also economic and social rights. This is important. Inclusive economy and inclusive politics. This is critical, not least for the empowerment of women.
Well, I will then say thank you so much to the audience for being here with us and asking questions, to the Tweetocracy who has been tweeting not questions but a lot of comments to what we've been said. Those of you who did turn off your mobile phones or are yet not present in the Twitter world can sign on and look it up. And thank you very, very much to the panel for very inspirational introductions and comments to good questions. I think there's a lot to learn. It illustrates how important these themes are, how complex they are, but there is also good reason for optimism. And for those of you who are interested in peace process, I was just told that a few seconds ago the presidents of Sudan and South Sudan actually did sign an agreement. So that's good news.
And let me just say that on behalf of the mature women on this panel, we are so proud of the young women on it. It's just wonderful.